There are thresholds in your life that you only recognize in retrospect. They aren't grand archways or ceremonial gates. They are quiet, unassuming things. A door left ajar. A question asked in the dark. The fractional, almost imperceptible shift in weight when someone you love falls asleep on your shoulder. For me, the threshold was the exact pressure of Caleb's temple against my collarbone, a demarcation line between the world as it had been and the world as it was about to become. It arrived disguised as an ordinary Tuesday night, under the dim, buttery glow of the reading lamp in our living room, a space that had, until that moment, felt reliably and safely platonic. He had been quiet for nearly an hour, a rare and precious stillness for a man whose very essence was kinetic energy. Caleb was a creature of motion, a swimmer whose life was measured in split seconds and powerful, slicing movements through water. Even on land, he vibrated with a restless hum, a constant jiggling of a knee, a tapping of fingers, a pacing from one end of our small apartment to the other, as if charting a new, unswum lap. But tonight, the storm inside him seemed to have finally exhausted itself. He was just a shape on the couch beside me, folded into the corner of the cushions, his long legs drawn up, his head eventually, inevitably, listing sideways until it found its resting place against me. The first contact was a gentle bump, a silent apology, and I had frozen, my entire nervous system lighting up like a city skyline at dusk. I held my breath, waiting for him to jerk awake, to mumble an excuse and retreat to the safe, prescribed distance our friendship had always maintained. But he didn't. Instead, he sighed, a sound so soft it was more of a feeling than a noise, a puff of warm air against the fabric of my shirt. He settled deeper, a final, minute adjustment that was not a retreat, but an arrival. And in that surrender, the architecture of our universe was redrawn. The 3 feet of space between our bedroom doors, the invisible line down the middle of the sofa, the carefully unspoken rules that had governed our cohabitation for 2 years, they all dissolved in the quiet warmth of his trust. I sat there, a camera on a tripod, capturing a moment too fragile to touch. My own body was rigid, a statue of terrified reverence. I could feel the fine, soft strands of his dark hair tickling my neck, smell the faint, lingering scent of the chlorine that clung to him like a second skin, mixed with the simple, clean smell of his laundry detergent. It was the scent of Caleb, a fragrance I had cataloged and stored away in a part of my heart I rarely dared to visit. My mind, my over-analytical, catastrophizing mind, began to spin. It was a dark room where I developed every possible interpretation of this single, simple action. The platonic explanation was the most likely, the safest negative to print. He was exhausted. His swim season was in full swing, the pressure mounting for the upcoming collegiate nationals. His recent, messy breakup with Sarah had left him emotionally raw, adrift in a sea of his own grief. He was seeking comfort, the simple, uncomplicated comfort of a friend. It meant nothing more. It was a gesture born of fatigue and sorrow, not affection. I held on to that thought like a lifeline, repeating it to myself, a mantra against the treacherous tide of hope that was beginning to pull at my ankles. But then there was the other print, the one I kept hidden, the one that was overexposed with all my secret, long-held longing. This print showed the subtle truth of the moment. He could have chosen the other end of the couch. He could have used a pillow. He could have, at any point, gone to his own bed, in his own room, a mere 15 feet away. He had chosen this proximity, this contact. He had chosen me. The weight of his head was more than just physical. It was a weight of trust, of vulnerability, of something I hadn't yet dared to name. I felt like an archaeologist who had stumbled upon a tomb that was not supposed to exist, filled with artifacts of a feeling I thought I was the only one to possess. To move, to even breathe too deeply, felt like it would risk shattering everything, turning it all to dust. So I remained perfectly still, my own exhaustion a distant echo, my focus narrowed to the single point of contact where his world had finally, blessedly, come to rest against mine. This was the threshold, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that I had just stepped across it. Our friendship hadn't begun with such fraught, silent intensity. It had started with the percussive crash of water and the clean, sharp scent of chlorine 3 years prior. I was a photography student, tasked with capturing dynamics in motion for my portfolio, and the university's natatorium was a cathedral of the very concept. Light from the high, clear-story windows shattered on the churning surface of the pool, turning the water into a frantic mosaic of blue and white. The air was thick with humidity and the rhythmic, guttural breathing of athletes pushing their bodies to the absolute limit. I was an observer by nature, most comfortable behind the barrier of a lens, and this place was a sensory feast. My camera loved the way the swimmers' bodies cut through the water, the explosion of spray during a flip turn, the taut muscles in their backs as they launched from the starting blocks. And then I saw Caleb. Even in a pool full of elite athletes, he was different. There was a grace to his power, a fluidity that seemed less like a fight against the water and more like a conversation with it. He didn't just swim, he flowed. I found my lens returning to him again and again, tracking his lane, trying to capture the impossible elegance of his freestyle stroke. He was all lean muscle and focused intensity, a living sculpture of dedication. After the practice, as the team was packing up, he walked past me, water still streaming from his dark hair, plastering it to his forehead. He glanced at my camera, then at me, and offered a weary but genuine smile. "Get anything good?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle after the violent exertion I had just witnessed. I was startled, used to being an invisible presence on the sidelines of life. I think so," I stammered, feeling my face grow warm. "You have really great form." He laughed, a bright, easy sound that cut through the echoing dampness of the natatorium. "Thanks. All I can feel right now is the lactic acid. I'm Caleb, Leo," I replied, finding my footing. That was it. That was the beginning. It was an unremarkable exchange that blossomed into an unremarkable friendship, which is to say, it was the best kind. We discovered a shared love for terrible science fiction movies, late-night diner food, and the quiet companionship of studying together in the library without needing to fill the silence. He was the sun to my shadow, the motion to my stillness. He drew people in with an effortless gravity, his laughter echoing down dormitory hallways, while I was content to orbit at a safe distance, documenting the world from my quiet corner. Yet, he made space for me in his bright, bustling world. He'd save me a seat. He'd bring me a coffee. He'd argue passionately about whether a certain alien design was brilliant or ridiculous. He never made me feel like I was on the outside looking in. With him, I was simply in. My feelings for him developed the way a photograph does in a darkroom tray. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a faint outline emerging from the gray, then gradually gaining depth and contrast until the image was undeniable, permanent. It was in the small things. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he truly smiled. The focused little frown he got when he was trying to solve a complex coding problem for his computer science major. The unconscious way he'd reach out and briefly touch my arm to emphasize a point in a story. Each tiny gesture was a drop of developer solution, bringing the truth into sharper focus. I loved him. It was a quiet, hopeless, and deeply private fact. He started dating Sarah in our junior year. She was smart, funny, and ambitious, a perfect match for his energy. I liked her genuinely. I saw how happy she made him, and his happiness was a priority, even when it came with a dull, persistent ache in my own chest. I became their third wheel, the reliable, easygoing friend. I photographed their candid moments, capturing the way he looked at her, and filed those images away as proof that my own feelings were meant to remain in the darkroom, undeveloped and unprinted. I built walls around that part of myself, sturdy and soundproof, because the foundation of our friendship was too precious to risk cracking with the weight of my unrequited love. We were Leo and Caleb, best friends. It was a solid, dependable structure. We decided to get an apartment together after graduation, a natural extension of our easy cohabitation. It made sense. He was starting a demanding job as a software consultant, and I was trying to make a living as a freelance photographer. We were anchors for each other in the uncertain sea of post-college life. The platonic foundation felt unshakable. The first crack in that foundation appeared on a rainy Tuesday in October. I came home to find the apartment unusually dark and silent. Caleb's gym bag was dropped by the door, and a trail of damp footprints led towards the living room. I found him sitting on the floor, his back against the couch, staring at the rain-streaked window. He didn't turn when I came in. The vibrant energy that always surrounded him was gone, replaced by a hollow, cavernous stillness. "Hey," I said softly, setting my camera bag down with deliberate care. "You okay?" He shook his head, a small, tight motion. His voice, when it came, was rough and thin. "Sarah and I broke up." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. There was nothing I could say that would fix it, so I did the only thing I could. I walked over, slid down to the floor beside him, and simply sat there, our shoulders not quite touching, offering my silent presence as a bulwark against the storm that had clearly broken over him. We sat like that for a long time, watching the rain trace paths down the glass, the silence in the room a shared, grieving space. His pain was a physical thing, a palpable aura of misery that filled the apartment. I wanted to reach out, to pull him into a hug, to absorb some of his hurt, but I was paralyzed by the old, familiar fear of crossing a line. My comfort could be misinterpreted. My affection was a loaded weapon. Eventually, he spoke again, his voice a low murmur. She said, "I'm emotionally unavailable. That I use training and work to hide. That I don't know how to just be with someone." He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Maybe she's right." "She's not," I said, the words coming out with more force than I intended. You feel things deeply. You just don't always know what to do with them." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes red-rimmed and lost. In that moment, he wasn't the confident, powerhouse swimmer or the brilliant coder. He was just a man whose heart was broken, whose map of the world had been torn to pieces. "What am I supposed to do now, Leo?" he whispered. "For now," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You just breathe. I'll order a pizza." That night was the beginning of the shift. After we ate, we put on one of our old, terrible sci-fi movies, a familiar comfort. But the easy banter was gone. He was a ghost of himself, staring blankly at the screen. When the movie ended, he didn't get up. He just curled into the corner of the couch, pulling an Afghan over himself. "I don't think I can be alone in my room right now," he admitted, his voice muffled by the blanket. "Is it cool if I just crash out here?" "Of course," I said, my heart constricting. "Whatever you need." I went to my own room, leaving the door slightly ajar, a habit I had for the airflow. But that night, it felt different. It felt like I was leaving a line open, a channel of communication in the quiet darkness. I lay in bed, listening to the sound of his unsteady breathing from the living room, the occasional sniffle he tried to hide. He was grieving, and my role was to be the steady, unmovable friend. It was a role I knew how to play. I just had to ignore the part of me that wished, desperately, that he had asked to be in my room instead, that he had closed the distance between us completely. That was a dangerous wish, a fault line running directly beneath the foundation of our friendship. I told myself to ignore it, to bury it, to pretend it wasn't there. But I could feel the tremors all the same. The couch became his sanctuary. For the first week, it was an unspoken arrangement. I'd wake up in the morning to find him tangled in the Afghan, his face etched with a troubled sleep. I'd make coffee, leaving a mug for him on the end table, and go about my day, editing photos at my desk in the corner of the living room while he slept. The apartment, once a space of shared, easy noise, his music, my podcasts, our conversations, became a library of quiet support. I moved with a new kind of caution, careful not to wake him, my footsteps soft on the floorboards, the click of my camera shutter a distant, muffled beat. I was a guardian of his rest, a silent watchman in the night of his sorrow. I observed the subtle stages of his grief as if I were documenting a slow, natural process, like a flower wilting. At first, he was all sharp edges and coiled tension, even in sleep. He'd twitch and murmur, his hands clenched into fists. Then, slowly, a fragile softness began to creep back in. The tension in his jaw would release, his hands would uncurl. He started seeking comfort more actively, more unconsciously. It began with a pillow. He'd grab one of the throw pillows and hug it to his chest, a substitute for the warmth he'd lost. I'd watch him from my desk, the glow of my monitor illuminating the scene, and my chest would ache with a feeling that was a painful hybrid of empathy and envy. I wanted to be that pillow. I wanted to be the object of that unconscious, desperate need for comfort. Then came the night of the threshold, the Tuesday that redrew the map. It was about 2 weeks after the breakup. He'd had a brutal day of training followed by a draining meeting with his boss. He came home looking hollowed out, the vibrant light in his eyes dimmed to a pilot light. He collapsed onto the couch, not even bothering with the pretense of watching a movie. I was working late on a deadline, the rhythmic click-clack of my keyboard the only sound in the room. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't notice his slow, gravitational drift across the expanse of the sofa. I didn't notice until the first, tentative contact, that gentle bump of his head against my arm. And then, the settling, the surrender. That first night, he slept on my shoulder for 3 hours. 3 hours in which I did not move. My arm went numb, pins and needles prickling from my elbow to my fingertips. My neck grew stiff. My own exhaustion was a heavy cloak. But I couldn't bring myself to disturb him. The peace on his face was too rare, too precious. It was a fragile truce in the war he was fighting with himself, and I was, somehow, the neutral ground where it could be negotiated. When he finally stirred, it was with a soft groan. He blinked, slowly coming back to himself, and his eyes widened in confusion as he realized where he was. He shot upright, a blush creeping up his neck. "Oh man, Leo, I'm so sorry," he stammered, running a hand through his already messy hair. I completely passed out. "Your arm must be dead." "It's fine," I said, trying to sound casual as I flexed my tingling fingers. "You look like you needed the sleep." "Still," he said, avoiding my eyes. "I shouldn't have, sorry." He retreated to his room without another word, the click of his door closing behind him feeling like a final verdict. I thought that would be the end of it. An anomaly. A one-time crossing of a boundary that he now regretted. I went to bed that night with a familiar sense of disappointment, a quiet resignation. I had misinterpreted the data. It was just fatigue. Nothing more. But the next night, he did it again. This time, it felt more deliberate. He sat closer to me from the start, under the guise of looking at the photos I was editing. He'd point to the screen, his arm brushing against mine, and ask questions about f-stops and shutter speeds. His interest was genuine, but there was a new quality to his proximity, a searching. The conversation eventually petered out, and a comfortable silence fell. I kept working, hyper-aware of him beside me. And then, slowly, deliberately, his head found its way to my shoulder again. There was no accidental bump this time. It was a conscious choice. He sighed, that same soft exhalation of relief, and melted against me. This time, I didn't freeze. I breathed. I accepted the weight of him. After a few minutes of fierce internal debate, I slowly, cautiously, lifted my free hand and rested it on his back, between his shoulder blades. I felt the solid, warm reality of him beneath my palm. Through the thin fabric of his t-shirt, I could feel the gentle rise and fall of his breathing. He didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to relax further into the touch, a low hum of contentment vibrating through him. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hand was steady. I was terrified, and I had never felt more at peace. This became our ritual. It was a silent, nightly negotiation. He would end his day, drained and heavy-limbed, and find his way to the couch. I would be there, a fixed point in his chaotic orbit. He would settle beside me, and eventually, he would come to rest against me. And I would let him. I learned the topography of his sleep. I learned that he mumbled when he was dreaming of swimming, his fingers twitching as if pulling through water. I learned that the little furrow between his brows smoothed out completely only when he was in the deepest part of sleep. I learned that the weight of him against me was the most profound comfort I had ever known. The living room became a sacred space, a bubble of intimacy that existed outside the normal rules of the world. In the daylight hours, we were back to being Leo and Caleb, best friends. We'd joke, we'd make plans with other people, we'd navigate our lives as two separate, independent entities. But when night fell and the exhaustion of the day settled in, the boundaries would dissolve, and we would become this strange, new thing, a single shape of shared comfort in the dim light of the living room. I lived for those hours. They were a secret garden I tended to in my heart, a place of impossible, terrifying beauty. I was so focused on analyzing the present, on hoarding these precious moments of closeness, that I never stopped to think about where this path was leading. I was content to walk it, one quiet, terrifying step at a time, for as long as he would let me. The ritual evolved, as all rituals do. The autumn chill began to seep into our old, drafty apartment, and the couch, once a sanctuary, became less comfortable. One night, a particularly cold front had moved in, rattling the windows in their frames. Caleb was shivering, even wrapped in the thickest Afghan we owned. He was huddled on his end of the sofa, trying to sleep, but his restlessness was a palpable thing. I was at my desk, trying to finish a project, but the sound of his chattering teeth was a constant, painful distraction. "You're not going to be able to sleep like that," I finally said, turning in my chair. "You're going to freeze." He looked over at me, his face pale in the glow of my monitor. "I'm fine," he insisted, though a violent shiver betrayed him. "No, you're not," I said, a new boldness taking root in me, born of a genuine concern that momentarily overrode my usual caution. "Come on. It's warmer in my room." The words hung in the air between us, a bridge I had just thrown across a chasm I never thought I'd dare to span. I had offered him entry into my most private space. My room was my fortress, the one place that was entirely mine, filled with my books, my prints, the quiet hum of my own thoughts. I held my breath, waiting for him to refuse, to recognize the enormity of the offer and retreat. He hesitated for a long moment, his gaze flickering from my face to the dark doorway of my bedroom. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the exhaustion warring with a deep-seated uncertainty. Finally, he gave a small, defeated nod. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He untangled himself from the blanket and followed me down the short hallway. The 3 feet between our doors had always felt like a vast, uncrossable territory. Tonight, we crossed it together. I held the door open for him, and he slipped past me into the relative warmth of my room. I felt the ghost of his presence brush against my arm, a spark of electricity in the cold air. I closed the door behind us, the soft click of the latch sealing us in, separating us from the rest of the world. The room suddenly felt very small, charged with a new, unspoken tension. "You can, take the bed," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet space. "I can take the floor. I have a sleeping bag." He shook his head, already pulling back the comforter on my bed. "Don't be ridiculous, Leo. It's your bed. I'll take the floor. We could share," I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It's a queen. There's plenty of room." I braced myself for the rejection, for the awkward laugh, for him to finally see the truth I was so desperately trying to hide. But Caleb just looked at me, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He seemed to be weighing my words, not for their hidden meaning, but for their simple, practical logic. "Okay," he said again, just as quietly as before. "If you're sure it's okay." I was not sure it was okay. I was sure it was the most dangerous, reckless, wonderful thing I had ever agreed to. I'm sure. I lied, or maybe I told the deepest truth. That first night in my bed was a masterclass in tension. We lay on our respective sides, a 6-inch canyon of empty space between us, as rigid and unmoving as 2 figures on a tomb. I was hyper-aware of every single thing. The sound of his breathing, deeper and closer than it had ever been. The way the mattress dipped slightly with his weight. The faint warmth that radiated from his body across the cold sheets. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling, my hands clenched at my sides. My heart was a wild bird beating against my ribs, desperate for escape. I was certain he could hear it. Sleep felt like an impossibility. My mind was a racetrack of frantic thoughts. What did this mean? Was this still just about comfort? Was he so lost in his own grief that he was blind to the new intimacy we were creating? Or was he a willing participant, consciously walking this path with me? I had no answers, only the overwhelming, terrifying, wonderful reality of his presence beside me in the dark. After what felt like hours, I heard him shift, the rustle of the sheets deafening in the silence. "Leo," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the mattress directly into my bones. "Yeah," I whispered back, my own voice tight with apprehension. "Thanks," he said, "for this, for everything. Anytime," I managed to reply. He rolled onto his side, facing away from me. A few minutes later, his breathing evened out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He had retreated to his side of the new border. But he hadn't left the room. He hadn't built the wall back up. He had stayed. And for now, that was more than enough. I eventually fell into a light, restless sleep, my dreams filled with images of open doors and unbridged chasms. The bed became the new couch. The pretext of the cold autumn nights lingered, but we both knew it had become something more. It was a routine. He would finish his day, and without a word, he would head to my room. He'd crawl into his side of the bed while I finished up my work or read a book. The initial, rigid tension of that first night slowly began to soften. The 6-inch canyon between us gradually narrowed. It happened in small, incremental ways. A foot accidentally brushing against mine in the night. His arm thrown out in sleep, his hand landing on my back. Each new point of contact was a fresh shock to my system, a new piece of data to be endlessly analyzed. I never initiated. I was too afraid. I let him be the unknowing initiator, the one who dictated the pace of our strange, silent dance. I was the quiet observer, the one who held his breath and waited. Some nights, we would sleep turned away from each other, our backs forming a new kind of wall between us. On other nights, the gravitational pull was stronger. I'd wake in the middle of the night to find him shifted closer, his forehead pressed against my shoulder blade, his breath warming the back of my neck. On those nights, sleep was a distant country I could not visit. I would simply lie there, awash in a feeling so potent it was almost painful, a mixture of profound love and profound terror. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief. This fragile bubble of intimacy felt like it could pop at any moment. A wrong word, a sudden movement, a flicker of acknowledgement in the daylight hours. Any of these could shatter the delicate illusion we had constructed. We never spoke of it. In the morning, we would get up, get coffee, and talk about his training or my latest project as if we hadn't just spent 8 hours sharing the same pillow, our legs tangled together under the comforter. The denial was a necessary component of the ritual. It was the plausible deniability that allowed it to continue. He needed comfort. I was providing it. It was the story we told ourselves. The thin veneer of platonic logic spread over a truth that was becoming increasingly, undeniably romantic. I started to see the change in him, not just in the way he slept, but in the way he was awake. The hollowed-out grief that had consumed him began to recede. The light started to return to his eyes. He laughed more, the real, full-bodied laugh that I had missed so much. He was still Caleb, my bright, kinetic Caleb, but there was a new softness to him, a new kind of quietude that he had learned from our nights together. He started to look at me differently, too. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me from across the room, his expression thoughtful, almost searching. It was the same look he had in the dark of my room, just before sleep would take him. It was a look that made my heart stumble. I was drowning, happily, in the ambiguity. I was so terrified of losing what we had, this precious, secret world, that I never dared to ask for more. I never dared to ask for clarity. The questions were a roaring fire in my mind. What are we doing? What does this mean to you? Do you feel it too? But I swallowed them down, night after night. The risk of asking was too great. The risk of hearing him say, "It means nothing, we're just friends," was a risk I could not afford to take. It would not just break my heart. It would incinerate the entire foundation of my world. So I stayed silent, and I waited, and I hoped. I hoped that one night, the unspoken thing between us would finally find a way to speak for itself. The moment arrived, as all pivotal moments do, without fanfare. It came on a Thursday night, almost 2 months into our new ritual. A storm was raging outside, a proper winter tempest with howling wind and sleet that pelted against the windows like handfuls of gravel. The power had been flickering all evening, casting the apartment in an eerie, strobing light. We had given up on any pretense of productivity and were huddled in my bed, listening to the storm and talking in low voices. The conversation was easy, meandering. We talked about our childhoods, about our most embarrassing moments, about our quiet, secret dreams for the future. He talked about swimming, not with the usual pressure and anxiety, but with the pure, simple love for the water that had first drawn him to it. I talked about photography, about the feeling of capturing a perfect, fleeting moment and making it permanent. There was a new level of honesty between us, a vulnerability that the storm outside seemed to be drawing out of us. The darkness of the room, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning, made it easier to say true things. We were lying on our sides, facing each other, the canyon between us finally gone completely. Our knees were bumping, our faces only a foot apart. I could see the glint of the occasional passing car's headlights reflected in his eyes. The conversation eventually wound down, and we fell into a comfortable, charged silence. The only sounds were the storm outside and the soft whisper of our own breathing. He was looking at me with that same searching expression I had come to know so well, but tonight it was more intense, more focused. It felt like he was trying to read something in my face, something I was trying my best to conceal. My heart began its familiar, frantic rhythm. This felt different. The air was thick with unspoken words, with months of accumulated tension and affection. The bubble of our secret world felt stretched to its absolute limit, shimmering and fragile. I was terrified it was about to burst. "Leo," he whispered, his voice a low thrum in the quiet room. My throat was dry. "Yeah." He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just kept looking at me, his gaze unwavering. I could see the subtle flicker of a dozen emotions in his eyes: confusion, fear, and something else, something soft and hopeful that mirrored my own. I felt pinned by his stare, completely exposed. "Can I ask you something weird?" he finally said, his voice hesitant. This is it, I thought. This is the moment it all falls apart. He's going to ask me if I have feelings for him. He's going to put me on the spot, and I'm going to crumble, and the beautiful, fragile thing we've built will shatter. "You can ask me anything," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. He took a slow, deep breath, as if steeling himself. He shifted slightly closer, the space between us now measured in inches. I could feel the warmth of his body, smell the clean scent of his skin. It was intoxicating and terrifying. "Would it be okay," he began, his voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper, "if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The storm outside, the rattling windows, the blood pounding in my ears, it all faded away. The only thing that existed was his question, hanging in the space between us. It was not a demand. It was not a confident move. It was a plea. It was a confession. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard. He was giving me all the power. He was giving me the choice to preserve the status quo or to shatter it completely. He was asking for permission to cross the final threshold. I didn't trust my voice. I was afraid that if I tried to speak, a sob or a laugh or some other uncontrollable sound would come out. So I just nodded. A small, jerky movement in the near darkness. But it was enough. His eyes, which had been wide with apprehension, softened with relief. He moved with an excruciating slowness, as if giving me every possible second to change my mind, to pull away. He raised a hand, his fingers cool and slightly trembling, and cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked gently against my cheek, a silent reassurance. And then, he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not hungry or demanding. It was soft. It was tentative. It was a question being answered. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty and a relief so profound it felt like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. It was just a gentle pressure, a brief, perfect moment of contact that said everything we had been unable to say for months. It said, "Yes, I feel it too. Yes, this is real. Yes, you are safe here." When he pulled back, his forehead came to rest against mine. His eyes were closed. His hand was still on my cheek, his thumb still making slow, soothing circles. "Okay," he breathed out, a single word that held a universe of meaning. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. It was an arrival. "Okay," I whispered back, and this time my voice worked. I lifted my own hand and covered his, holding it there against my face. The storm still raged outside, but inside our small, quiet room, the storm had finally passed. The tension that had been building for months had broken, not in a violent crash, but in a soft, gentle rain. We didn't say anything else. We didn't need to. We just stayed like that, forehead to forehead, hand in hand, breathing in the quiet, certain air of our new world. For the first time in months, I fell into a deep, dreamless, and profoundly peaceful sleep, with the weight of him finally, truly, at rest beside me. The morning after was a landscape of surreal, quiet beauty. I woke up first, to the pale gray light of a post-storm dawn filtering through the blinds. The world outside was washed clean, hushed, and dripping. The air in the room was still and warm. Caleb was still asleep, his face turned towards me, his expression more peaceful than I had ever seen it. His arm was slung across my waist, his hand resting on my hip, a casual, proprietary gesture that sent a fresh wave of wonder through me. Last night had not been a dream. The evidence was right there, warm and real, and breathing softly beside me. I lay there for a long time, not wanting to move, not wanting to break the spell. I studied the curve of his eyelashes against his cheek, the slight parting of his lips, the steady, even rise and fall of his chest. I was memorizing this moment, developing it in the darkroom of my mind, fixing it so it could never fade. This was a new kind of ritual, a morning inventory of my own happiness. The fear and anxiety that had been my constant companions for months were gone, replaced by a quiet, humming certainty. Everything had changed. But the quiet certainty of the dawn is a fragile thing. As the city outside began to wake up, so did the world of our old anxieties. Caleb stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked a few times, his gaze slowly coming into focus on my face. For a brief, perfect second, a soft, sleepy smile touched his lips. And then, comprehension dawned. And with it, a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long time, panic. He pulled his arm back as if he'd been burned. He sat up, scrubbing a hand over his face, pointedly not looking at me. The intimate bubble of our shared space popped, the air rushing out, leaving a sudden, sharp chill. I should go," he mumbled, his voice rough with sleep and something else. He scrambled out of bed, grabbing his clothes from the floor where he'd dropped them the night before. He moved with a frantic, clumsy energy, a stark contrast to the gentle slowness of the previous night. "Caleb," I said, sitting up. My own voice sounded small, uncertain. The humming certainty in my chest was being replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "I'm late for practice," he said, his back still to me as he pulled on his shirt. It was a flimsy excuse. His practice didn't start for another 2 hours. He was running. He was running from me, from what we had done. "Caleb, wait," I pleaded, but he was already at the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, but he didn't turn around. "We can't," he said, his voice so low I could barely hear it. "I can't. I'm sorry, Leo." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was left alone in the sudden, deafening silence of my room. The sheets beside me were still warm from his body. The air still held the faint scent of him. But he was gone. The threshold we had crossed together last night, he had just sprinted back over it, leaving me stranded on the other side. The beautiful, fragile world we had built had shattered after all, and the sound of it breaking was the sound of my own heart. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. They were a masterclass in avoidance and miscommunication. Caleb became a ghost in our own apartment. He left for the pool before I woke up and came home long after I had gone to bed, or at least long after I had retreated to my room and turned off the lights, pretending to be asleep. The living room couch, once our sanctuary, sat empty. The hallway between our rooms was once again a vast, uncrossable no man's land. We communicated, when we had to, through terse, functional text messages. Need you to pick up milk. Leaving rent on the counter, each message was a small, sharp shard of glass in my inbox. The pain was a physical thing, a constant, dull ache behind my sternum. It was worse than the years of silent, unrequited love. Before, I had the comfort of our friendship. I had his laughter, his presence, his easy companionship. Now, I had nothing but a crushing, echoing silence. The hope he had given me, that single, perfect kiss in the dark, had become a source of torment. It replayed in my mind on a loop, a beautiful, poisonous memory. Had I imagined the vulnerability in his voice? Had I misinterpreted the softness of his touch? Had I projected all of my own longing onto a simple, misguided moment of grief-stricken confusion on his part? My mind, my old, familiar enemy, spun out a dozen different scenarios, each one more painful than the last. The worst was the idea that he pitied me, that he had sensed my feelings and, in a moment of weakness and gratitude, had given me what he thought I wanted, only to regret it in the harsh light of day. The thought made me feel sick, exposed, and profoundly foolish. I had been so careful for so long, building my walls, guarding my heart, and I had let him walk right in, only to watch him turn around and demolish the entire structure on his way out. I tried to lose myself in work. I took on every project I could, spending long hours in my makeshift darkroom, the smell of chemicals a sharp, acrid distraction. I photographed stark, empty cityscapes, images of architectural loneliness that mirrored my own internal landscape. But even there, he followed me. I'd see a couple walking hand in hand, and the ache in my chest would sharpen. I'd see the light hit a building in a certain way and be reminded of the way the dawn had looked on his face. He was everywhere. He was the ghost in my machine. After a week of this silent, agonizing Cold War, I knew I couldn't go on. The ambiguity was destroying me. The not knowing was worse than any possible truth. I needed to hear it from him, whatever it was. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me what that kiss had meant and why he had run. I needed an ending to the story, even if it was a tragic one. I couldn't live in this state of suspended emotional animation any longer. I waited for him. That night, I didn't retreat to my room. I sat on the couch, the same couch where our ritual had begun, and I waited. The apartment was dark, save for the single reading lamp I had left on, a small beacon in the oppressive gloom. I heard his key in the lock just after midnight. He stepped inside, quiet as a shadow, clearly expecting me to be asleep. He stopped dead when he saw me sitting there. "Leo," he said, his voice laced with surprise and exhaustion. "You're still up. We need to talk, Caleb," I said, my own voice flat, devoid of the pleading tone he had heard last. I was done pleading. I was hurt, but I was also angry. Angry at him for his cowardice, and angry at myself for letting my hope make me so vulnerable. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound, and dropped his gym bag to the floor. He didn't move to turn on more lights, leaving us in the small, isolated pool of lamplight. "I know," he said. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at a spot on the floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "No, you don't know," I said, my voice gaining a harder edge. "You don't know what this week has been like. You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me, and then just disappear. You don't get to treat me like a stranger in our own home." "I'm sorry," he mumbled, still not looking at me. "Don't apologize," I snapped, standing up. I needed to be on his level. "Explain. I deserve an explanation. What was that? What was that kiss? What were all those nights? Was it all just a game? Were you just using me for comfort because you were sad about Sarah? Am I just your human security blanket?" The questions I had been swallowing for months came pouring out, hot and bitter. He finally looked up at me, and I was shocked by what I saw. His face was a mask of misery. His eyes were red-rimmed, not with the grief I had seen before, but with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and fear. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "No, Leo, it wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" I demanded, stepping closer. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you broke my heart and then ran away because you were too scared to even talk about it." "I am scared," he burst out, his voice finally rising. "Of course I'm scared. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure desperation. "My whole life, everything has been simple. It's been swimming and school and girls. It's a straight line. I know the rules. And then you." He started pacing, that old, familiar kinetic energy returning. But this time it was frantic, panicked. "This thing with us, it doesn't have any rules. I don't know what it is. All I know is that after Sarah left, I was drowning. And being with you, on this couch, in your room, it was the only time I felt like I could breathe. It was the only place I felt safe." He stopped and looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I started to need it. I started to need you. Not just as a friend. It was something more. And it terrified me. Because I love you, Leo. I think I've been falling in love with you for months, and I didn't even realize it until it was so complete that I couldn't ignore it anymore. And that night, in the storm, I just wanted to know if it was possible that you felt it, too." His confession hung in the air, a stunning, beautiful, and heartbreaking admission. He had said the words I had only ever dreamed of hearing, but they were laced with so much fear. "So you kissed me," I said softly, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a vast, aching tenderness. "And I kissed you back. And it was real." "Yes," he whispered. "It was the realest thing that has ever happened to me." And the next morning, I woke up, and I saw you there, and all I could think was, "I'm going to ruin this. I'm going to ruin you. I don't know how to be this person, this version of me that's in love with my best friend. It's not the straight line. It's messy, and it's complicated, and I'm going to break the most important thing in my life. I'm going to break our friendship." "So you decided to break my heart instead?" I asked, the question gentle, not accusatory. Tears welled in his eyes, and he finally closed the distance between us. He stopped right in front of me, his hands hovering in the air as if he was afraid to touch me. "I'm an idiot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I panicked. I thought if I ran away, I could put it all back in the box. I could go back to the way things were. But I can't. It's worse. This silence between us is so much worse than being scared. "I miss you. I miss my friend. I'm right here," I said, my own voice trembling. "I've been here the whole time." "I know," he choked out. "And I'm so sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I was just so scared of what it meant, for me, for us." I finally reached out and took his hands. They were cold and trembling. I held them tightly in my own. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Caleb," I said, looking him directly in the eye. "I don't have it all figured out. All I know is that for years, I've been in love with my best friend. And for the last 2 months, I've been living in this beautiful, terrifying dream. And I don't want to wake up. Not if it means going back to the way things were." A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He squeezed my hands. "I don't want to go back either," he whispered. "I just don't know how to go forward. We do it together," I said simply. "One step at a time. No more running." He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of profound release. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for a week, for a month, for a lifetime. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Together," he repeated, the word a promise. And then he leaned in, just as he had in the dark of my room, and he kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. There was no question. It was a kiss of apology, of confession, of homecoming. It was the end of the silence. It was the beginning of everything else. In the quiet aftermath of the confession, a new kind of architecture was constructed between us. The old, flimsy structures of plausible deniability and unspoken rules were torn down, and in their place, we began to build something new, something honest. It was slow, careful work. There were no grand declarations, no sudden, dramatic shifts. It was a process of small, intentional acts of construction. It was in the way he started looking me in the eye again, his gaze open and clear. It was in the way I stopped holding my breath every time he entered a room. The first morning after our talk, I woke up alone in my bed, and for a heart-stopping second, I felt the familiar pang of panic. But then I heard the sound of the coffee grinder from the kitchen, a familiar, domestic sound that had been absent for what felt like an eternity. I got up and walked into the living room, and there he was, standing by the counter, shirtless in his pajama pants, just as he had 100 times before. He looked up when I came in and gave me a small, shy smile. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, my heart settling into a new, steady rhythm. He held up a mug. "Coffee, please," I said. He passed it to me, our fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. It was a simple, mundane exchange, but it was imbued with all the weight of our new understanding. It was an acknowledgement. We were still us. We were still Leo and Caleb, in our apartment, making coffee. But the code underneath had been rewritten. The subtext was now just text. We didn't fall back into the old ritual of the bed. That ritual had been born of need and confusion, a temporary shelter. What we were building now was meant to be permanent. For a few nights, we slept in our own rooms, the doors left open, a silent testament to the new trust between us. It was a necessary recalibration, a way of proving to ourselves that our connection wasn't just about physical comfort in the dark. It was real in the daylight, too. We talked. We truly talked, not just about movies or swimming, but about his fears, about my long-held feelings, about what we wanted this new thing between us to be. It was Caleb who, after a week of this careful distance, knocked on my open door late one night. I was reading in bed, and he was just standing there in the hallway, looking uncertain. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied, putting my book down. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," he said, nodding. My room feels too big." He looked at me, his expression open and vulnerable. "Can I come in?" It was a different question than before. It wasn't a desperate plea for shelter from a storm. It was a simple, honest request for closeness. "Always," I said, and I moved over, pulling back the comforter on his side of the bed. He came in and closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was different this time. It wasn't about sealing us in, away from the world. It was about choosing to be in this space together, intentionally. He climbed into bed, and the silence that fell was not tense or fraught with unspoken meaning. It was peaceful. He turned onto his side to face me. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "It's more than okay," I said. I reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind his ear. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing for a moment. "I'm still scared sometimes," he admitted in a whisper, "that I won't be good at this." "You don't have to be good at it," I whispered back. "We just have to be honest." He opened his eyes and looked at me, a real, crinkle-eyed smile spreading across his face. "Okay," he said, "I can do honest." He shifted closer, and I met him halfway. He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me against his chest, and I rested my head in the familiar space of his shoulder. But this time, it was different. I was not a statue, terrified to move. He was not an unconscious seeker of comfort. We were two people, choosing to hold each other. His chin came to rest on the top of my head, and I felt him press a soft kiss into my hair. It was a quiet gesture of possession, of affection, of belonging. I sighed, a deep, contented sound, and felt his arms tighten around me in response. There was no more ambiguity. There was no more fear. There was just the solid, warm weight of him, the steady beat of his heart against my ear, and the profound, unshakable peace of being exactly where I was supposed to be. We began to build a new life in the framework of the old one. It was a life of quiet domesticity, of shared intimacies that were no longer secret or fraught. It was waking up tangled together in the mornings and arguing playfully over who had to get up and make the coffee. It was me going to his swim meets, not as a hidden admirer behind a lens, but as his boyfriend, his partner, the one he looked for in the crowd before he stepped up to the block. It was him coming into my darkroom, wrapping his arms around me from behind while I worked, resting his chin on my shoulder, and watching the images slowly appear in the chemical bath, his presence a warm, steady anchor in my quiet world. The couch, once a symbol of our ambiguous turmoil, became a place of simple, easy affection. We'd watch our terrible sci-fi movies, and he'd have his head in my lap, my fingers idly tracing patterns in his hair. The weight of him was no longer a demarcation line of change, but a simple, happy fact of my life. The fear of ruining our friendship had been replaced by the wonderful, startling realization that our love was not a risk to our friendship, but its truest and most natural evolution. We had been building the foundation for this all along. We just hadn't known how to read the blueprints. We learned to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. We found that the deepest conversations could be had without a single word, in a shared look across a room, in the simple act of reaching for a hand, in the quiet comfort of falling asleep in the arms of the person who felt, finally and completely, like home. The threshold I had recognized on that long-ago Tuesday night had not been an ending or a beginning, but simply a doorway. It was a quiet, unassuming entrance into the rest of my life. And I had walked through it, not alone, but with him. Together.